Here's what they don't tell you about running the galaxy's most prestigious educational institution. Eventually, you'll encounter humans, and humans have this annoying tendency to fall asleep at the worst possible moments. Professor Zet Clawmark here, Director of Advanced Learning at the Galactic Educational Institute, and I was about to learn that one unconscious human could single-handedly destroy 47 different species worth of educational tradition. The whole situation started when we accepted our first human exchange student. Dr. Beth Starlight was supposed to be observing our advanced xenobiology program for 6 weeks, taking notes on our superior educational methodologies, and writing glowing reports about Galactic Institute standards. Instead, she spent most of her first week looking increasingly horrified at what she called our educational practices. Professor Clawmark, my assistant, Grix Swifttail, announced during our weekly staff meeting, "The Human Observer has submitted a formal complaint about lecture volume levels." Lecture volume levels. Leave it to humans to complain about perfectly reasonable teaching standards. What exactly is her complaint? I asked, though I suspected it would be typically human in its unreasonableness. She claims that shouting at students for 8 hours straight constitutes acoustic trauma and psychological abuse. She's also questioning why our cubs are required to remain motionless and silent during instruction periods. Acoustic trauma. Our traditional teaching methods had produced the galaxy's finest scholars for centuries, and this human thought we were traumatizing students by maintaining proper discipline. Grix, please inform Dr. Starlight that our educational techniques are based on thousands of years of proven results. Rigorous discipline, sustained attention spans, and absolute respect for authority are the foundations of academic achievement. I tried explaining that, sir. She asked if we had any evidence that our methods actually improve learning outcomes. Evidence that our methods improve learning. The audacity was breathtaking. Yes. Of course we have evidence, I replied with the patience reserved for particularly dense subordinates. Our graduates go on to prestigious positions throughout the galaxy. Our academic rankings are consistently excellent. Our standards are universally respected. She asked for specific data, comparing our methods to alternative approaches. Alternative approaches. As if there were alternatives to proper educational discipline. Grix. Schedule a meeting with Dr. Starlight. I'll personally explain why our methods represent the pinnacle of educational achievement. That afternoon, I found myself sitting across from Dr. Beth Starlight in my office, preparing to educate this human about the finer points of academic excellence. She was a small woman, with brown hair and unnervingly bright blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything she saw with uncomfortable intensity. Dr. Starlight, I began with my most authoritative tone. I understand you have concerns about our teaching methodologies. Concerns? She replied with that irritating human habit of turning statements into questions. Professor Clawmark, you're essentially running a prison camp disguised as an educational institution. Prison camp. Clearly, humans had no appreciation for structured learning environments. Dr. Starlight, discipline is essential for academic achievement. Our students must learn to focus their attention, respect their instructors, and absorb information efficiently. By sitting motionless for 8 hours while teachers scream at them? She asked with obvious disbelief. Professor, that's not education. That's torture. Torture. Humans had such a flair for dramatic exaggeration. Our methods produce results, I insisted. Our graduates demonstrate superior knowledge retention and academic performance. According to what measurements? And compared to what alternatives? Compared to what alternatives? She kept asking questions I had never needed to consider before. Dr. Starlight, we are the Galactic Educational Institute. We represent the highest standards of academic achievement in known space. Our methods don't require comparison because they are already optimal. She looked at me with that unsettling human expression that suggested she found my reasoning amusing rather than convincing. Professor, have you ever considered that there might be better ways to help students learn? Better ways. The suggestion that our perfect system could be improved was absurd. Such as interactive engagement, collaborative learning, respecting student input, encouraging questions, allowing movement and discussion. She ticked off each item as if she were describing revolutionary concepts rather than obvious recipes for classroom anarchy. Encouraging questions. The idea of students questioning their instructors was fundamentally subversive. Dr. Starlight. Those approaches lead to chaos, indiscipline, and academic failure. Students need structure, authority, and clear expectations. Do they? Or do they need inspiration, engagement, and the freedom to think for themselves? Freedom to think for themselves. Education was about transmitting knowledge, not encouraging independent thought. Dr. Starlight. I'll arrange for you to observe our most advanced class tomorrow. Professor Fang Ironteeth is conducting a comprehensive review of quantum mechanics theory. You'll see our methods in action. The next morning, I personally escorted Dr. Starlight to Professor Ironteeth's lecture hall, confident that she would finally understand the superiority of our educational approach. Professor Ironteeth was our most respected instructor. His lectures were models of academic rigor, disciplinary control, and informational density. The scene that greeted us was exactly what I expected. 200 students sitting in perfect rows, maintaining absolute silence and motionless attention, while Professor Ironteeth delivered his comprehensive analysis of quantum field theory. His voice carried clearly across the lecture hall as he methodically explained complex mathematical concepts without interruption or distraction. As you can see, I whispered to Dr. Starlight. Perfect educational efficiency. Professor Ironteeth can cover an enormous amount of material because he doesn't waste time on unnecessary student interactions. Dr. Starlight was staring at the scene with what looked like barely contained horror. Professor Clawmark, look at those students. Really look at them. Really look at them. I looked at the perfectly disciplined students maintaining proper academic posture and attention. What am I supposed to see? Far. Half of them are asleep. The other half are fighting to stay awake. And the ones who are awake look absolutely miserable. Half of them are asleep. I focused my attention more carefully and realized with growing alarm that she was right. Students throughout the lecture hall were displaying obvious signs of exhaustion, boredom, and disengagement. That's unusual, I admitted reluctantly. Professor, this isn't education. This is endurance testing. These students aren't learning. They're surviving. They're surviving. The distinction was more troubling than I wanted to acknowledge. Dr. Starlight, maintaining attention during challenging material is an essential academic skill. Maintaining attention is important, she agreed. But forcing students to sit motionless while someone talks at them for hours isn't teaching attention. It's teaching submission. Teaching submission. When she phrased it that way, our method sounded less impressive. That was when something extraordinary happened. Dr. Starlight, apparently overwhelmed by the combination of Professor Ironteeth's droning lecture and the oppressive atmosphere of enforced silence, simply fell asleep. Right there in the observation area, in full view of the lecture hall, she closed her eyes and began breathing deeply. Professor Ironteeth noticed immediately and stopped his lecture mid-sentence. Professor Clawmark, he announced loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. Your guest appears to be demonstrating the kind of disrespectful behavior we work so hard to eliminate from our students. Disrespectful behavior. Dr. Starlight's unconscious state was apparently a commentary on our teaching methods. The students, who had been maintaining perfect silence for over 3 hours, suddenly began showing signs of restlessness. Whispered conversations started breaking out. Students began shifting in their seats, and a few actually started giggling at the sight of the visiting human fast asleep during a formal lecture. Students, Professor Ironteeth roared with his most authoritative voice. Return to proper attention immediately. But something unprecedented was happening. Instead of immediately complying with his commands, the students were looking at the sleeping human with obvious fascination. Here was someone who had simply opted out of the torture session they were all enduring, and rather than being horrified by her lack of discipline, they seemed envious of her freedom. I said return to proper attention. Professor Ironteeth's voice reached levels that would have shattered glass. That was when the most shocking thing of all occurred. About 20 of the youngest students, cubs barely past their first academic year, suddenly stood up and began making noise. Not the organized recitation we encouraged, but actual expressions of distress and protest. "Professor," one of the cubs called out with unprecedented boldness, "why can't we be comfortable like the sleeping human? Why can't we be comfortable?" The question struck at the heart of our educational philosophy. "Sit down immediately," Professor Ironteeth commanded with volcanic authority. But the cubs weren't sitting down. More, were standing up, and they were making increasingly loud expressions of dissatisfaction. Some were actually crying. Not the silent tears of academic stress we occasionally tolerated, but loud, vocal complaints about their treatment. "I want to sleep too," called out another cub. "My back hurts from sitting still," added a third. "This is boring," declared a fourth, with the kind of honesty that adults spend lifetimes learning to suppress. "This is boring." The academic heresy was spreading faster than a plague. "Professor Clawmark," Professor Ironteeth said with growing desperation, "control your guest and restore order to my classroom." But I was transfixed by what was happening. The sleeping human had somehow triggered a student rebellion simply by demonstrating that it was possible to opt out of our educational system. And rather than looking like undisciplined anarchists, the protesting cubs looked like young beings who had finally found the courage to express their genuine needs. "Students," I announced, attempting to restore order, "Dr. Starlight is ill and requires rest. This is not an invitation to abandon your academic responsibilities." Academic responsibilities. The phrase sounded hollow when applied to motionless suffering. "But why do we have to hurt to learn?" asked one of the cubs with the kind of simple question that cut straight through centuries of educational tradition. Why do we have to hurt to learn? I realized I had no answer to that question. "Doctor." Starlight chose that moment to wake up, blinking in confusion at the chaos surrounding her. "What's happening?" she asked groggily. "Your behavior has triggered a student uprising," I informed her with as much dignity as I could maintain. She looked around at the cubs who were still standing and voicing their complaints, then at Professor Ironteeth who was shouting increasingly frantic commands for order, then back at me with growing understanding. "Oh," she said quietly. "They saw someone sleeping, comfortably, and realized they could be comfortable too." Realized they could be comfortable too. The simple observation contained revolutionary implications. "Dr. Starlight, you've disrupted our entire educational process." "Good," she replied with that infuriating human confidence. "Your educational process was hurting children. Your educational process was hurting children." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. "Professor Ironteeth," she called across the lecture hall, "why don't you try speaking more quietly? Maybe the students will actually listen if you're not screaming at them." Speaking more quietly, the suggestion was so radical it bordered on educational heresy. "Dr. Starlight, volume commands respect and maintains attention," Professor Ironteeth replied with academic authority. "Does it?" she asked, gesturing toward the students who were still protesting despite his increasingly loud commands. "Because it looks like volume creates resentment and rebellion." Volume creates resentment and rebellion. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. "Furthermore," she continued, standing up and addressing both the faculty and students, "learning should be engaging, not endured. Students should be active participants, not passive victims. Active participants, not passive victims." The distinction reframed everything about our approach to education. The cubs were still standing, still making noise. But now, they were listening to Dr. Starlight with obvious interest. For the first time since entering the lecture hall, they looked alert and engaged. "Students," Dr. Starlight said, and I noticed that her normal speaking voice carried better than Professor Ironteeth's shouting, "What would help you learn better? What would help you learn better?" No instructor in the history of our institution had ever asked students that question. "Comfortable chairs," called out one cub. "Questions allowed," added another. "Moving around sometimes," suggested a third. "Not so much yelling," declared a fourth. Not so much yelling. The cubs were providing direct feedback on our teaching methods. Professor Ironteeth, Dr. Starlight said with dangerous reasonableness. What if you tried incorporating some of those suggestions? Lower volume, more interaction, maybe let them stretch occasionally? Let them stretch occasionally. The suggestion threatened the very foundation of academic discipline. Dr. Starlight, those approaches would lead to chaos and learning failure. Would they? Or would they lead to engagement and genuine understanding? Engagement and genuine understanding. The alternative to our traditional methods sounded surprisingly appealing. Professor Ironteeth, faced with a classroom full of restless cubs and a human who had somehow achieved more student attention in 5 minutes than he had managed in 3 hours, made a decision that shocked everyone present. He lowered his voice to a normal conversational level. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The cubs, who had been protesting loudly, suddenly quieted down to listen. The students who had been fighting sleep perked up with interest. The oppressive atmosphere of forced attention transformed into something that looked suspiciously like voluntary engagement. Now, Professor Ironteeth said in his new, quieter voice, who can tell me what they actually understood about quantum mechanics from today's lecture? What they actually understood. For the first time, he was asking about learning outcomes rather than compliance. A few tentative hands went up. More student participation than we typically saw in an entire semester. Dr. Starlight settled back into her chair, looking satisfied. See? They're much more responsive when you treat them like intelligent beings instead of prisoners. Intelligent beings instead of prisoners. The comparison made me deeply uncomfortable because it was uncomfortably accurate. As I watched Professor Ironteeth attempt to conduct his first interactive lecture, with students actually asking questions and expressing interest, I realized that one sleeping human had accomplished something extraordinary. She had proven that our perfect educational system was fundamentally flawed. And the most disturbing part was that the students looked happier, more alert, and more engaged than I had ever seen them before. Word of the quantum mechanics uprising spread through the institute faster than an academic scandal. By evening, I had 17 different department heads demanding explanations, 43 faculty members requesting emergency meetings, and one very smug human who kept saying things like, "I told you so," without actually saying the words. Professor Clawmark, Dr. Frick's Mindsharp from the psychology department, announced during our hastily called emergency faculty meeting, "We're receiving reports of similar disruptions across multiple departments. Students are questioning teaching methods, requesting interactive discussions, and some are even sleeping voluntarily during lectures. Sleeping voluntarily during lectures." The horror was spreading. "How many departments?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would ruin whatever remained of my day. "All of them," replied Professor Wren Bladewing from Advanced Mathematics. My students actually asked me why they couldn't work problems collaboratively instead of sitting in silent isolation. When I explained that collaboration leads to academic dishonesty, they wanted to know what evidence I had for that claim. What evidence I had. Students were demanding evidence for fundamental educational principles. Professor Talon Swiftclaw from Xenobiology reports that her cubs are requesting permission to ask questions during lectures, added Dr. Spur Brighteye from the Literature Department. They claim the human demonstrated that curiosity is more important than compliance. Curiosity is more important than compliance. The philosophical foundation of our entire system was under attack. And Professor Raven Ironwing from Advanced Physics says her students want to conduct actual experiments instead of just memorizing theoretical frameworks, concluded Professor Blade Sharptooth from Engineering. They're saying that hands-on learning is more effective than passive absorption. Hands-on learning. Students wanted to actually touch things and participate in their own education. Dr. Beth Starlight, who had been sitting quietly in the corner taking notes with that irritating human habit of documenting everything, finally spoke up. "Professors, your students are simply expressing natural learning preferences. This isn't rebellion. It's educational awakening. Educational awakening." She made it sound like something positive rather than catastrophic. "Dr. Starlight," I said with as much patience as I could muster, You've disrupted our entire institutional culture in less than 24 hours. Our students are abandoning proven methodologies in favor of experimental approaches. Your proven methodologies, she replied, with dangerous calm, were proving that students could endure boredom and follow orders. They weren't proving that students were actually learning anything. The distinction was more uncomfortable than I wanted to admit. Our graduates achieve excellent positions throughout the galaxy. Professor Mindsharp interjected with academic pride. Because they've learned to comply with authority and suppress their natural curiosity. Dr. Starlight countered. But do they innovate? Do they solve complex problems? Do they think creatively? When had creative thinking become a desirable outcome? Creative thinking leads to chaos and unpredictable results, Professor Bladewing declared, with the certainty of someone who had never questioned fundamental assumptions. Creative thinking leads to breakthroughs and genuine understanding. Dr. Starlight replied. Your current system produces excellent test takers and terrible thinkers. Excellent test takers and terrible thinkers. The accusation struck uncomfortably close to truth. Dr. Starlight, I said carefully, what exactly are you proposing? That we abandon centuries of educational development in favor of unproven human methodologies? I'm proposing that you try treating your students like intelligent beings with natural curiosity instead of empty vessels that need to be filled with information through force. Empty vessels that need to be filled. Filled through force. Our educational philosophy sounded remarkably primitive when described that way. Furthermore, she continued with growing confidence, I'd like to demonstrate alternative teaching methods. With your permission, I'll conduct a sample class using human educational approaches. Human educational approaches. The phrase filled me with dread and curiosity in equal measure. Absolutely not, Professor Sharptooth declared. We cannot allow experimental methods to contaminate our academic standards. What if, Dr. Starlight suggested with that dangerous human reasonableness, we compare results? I'll teach a section using interactive methods, you continue with traditional approaches, and we'll measure actual learning outcomes. Measure actual learning outcomes. The concept was so radical it threatened everything we thought we knew about education. How would we measure learning outcomes? I asked reluctantly. Comprehension tests, problem-solving abilities, retention over time, application of knowledge to new situations, and student engagement levels. Student engagement levels. Since when had student engagement become a measurable outcome? The faculty exchanged uncomfortable glances. We had spent centuries measuring attendance, compliance, and test scores, but we had never actually investigated whether students understood and could apply what they had supposedly learned. Dr. Starlight, I said slowly, you're proposing to evaluate our entire educational system based on whether students actually learn rather than whether they follow instructions. Revolutionary concept, I know, she replied with that infuriating human smile. 3 days later, I found myself observing Dr. Starlight's first experimental class, with a mixture of professional curiosity and academic horror. She had somehow convinced 50 volunteer students to participate in what she called active learning. And the scene that greeted me defied every principle of proper educational conduct. Students were sitting in small groups, talking to each other. They were moving around the classroom freely. Some were even standing up while working on problems. And most shocking of all, Dr. Starlight was moving among them, answering questions and facilitating discussions rather than delivering authoritative lectures from a position of elevated authority. Dr. Starlight, I whispered. This looks like supervised chaos. This is collaborative learning, she replied quietly. Watch what happens when students feel safe to express their thoughts and ask questions. Feel safe to express their thoughts. When had student safety become an educational consideration? What I observed over the next 2 hours challenged every assumption I had ever held about effective teaching. Students were actively engaged with the material, asking thoughtful questions, building on each other's ideas, and demonstrating genuine understanding rather than rote memorization. Professor Clawmark, One of the cubs approached me directly, something that would have been unthinkable in a traditional classroom setting. This new way of learning is amazing. I actually understand quantum field theory instead of just memorizing formulas. Actually understand instead of just memorizing. The distinction highlighted a fundamental flaw in our traditional approach. How is your understanding different? I asked, genuinely curious. Before, I knew that certain equations produced correct answers on tests. Now I understand why those equations work and how to apply them to new problems. Why equations work and how to apply them. Comprehension versus compliance. Furthermore, another student added enthusiastically, Dr. Starlight encourages us to ask questions when we don't understand something instead of pretending we know everything. Encourages questions when you don't understand. Revolutionary pedagogy. But aren't you concerned about appearing ignorant in front of your classmates? I asked. Why would we be concerned about that? The first student replied with obvious confusion. Everyone's here to learn. Admitting you don't know something is the first step toward actually learning it. Admitting ignorance is the first step toward learning. The concept turned our entire academic culture upside down. Dr. Starlight approached as the students returned to their collaborative work. Professor, what do you observe about their engagement levels? I had to admit that the students appeared more alert, more interested, and more actively involved than any class I had ever witnessed. They seem enthusiastic about learning. Because they're actually learning instead of just enduring education, she explained. When students feel respected, challenged appropriately, and supported in their natural curiosity, they become active partners in the educational process. Active partners in the educational process. Students as collaborators, rather than victims. Over the following weeks, Dr. Starlight's experimental classes continued to produce results that challenged everything our faculty thought they knew about education. Students demonstrated superior comprehension, better problem-solving abilities, higher retention rates, and significantly increased motivation to continue learning. More disturbing still, word of the alternative teaching methods spread throughout the student population, leading to increasing requests for interactive classes, collaborative projects, and respectful treatment from instructors. Professor Clawmark, my assistant Grix, reported during our weekly administrative meeting, we're receiving formal petitions from student groups requesting educational reforms. They want smaller class sizes, interactive teaching methods, and the right to ask questions without penalty. The right to ask questions without penalty. Students were demanding basic intellectual freedoms. How many students have signed these petitions? Approximately 90% of our total enrollment. Grix replied with obvious bewilderment. 90%. The revolution was complete. Furthermore, he continued, we're receiving inquiries from other educational institutions requesting information about our innovative human teaching methodologies. Apparently, word has spread throughout the academic community. Innovative human teaching methodologies. Our crisis had become our reputation. Dr. Starlight chose that moment to enter my office, carrying what appeared to be comprehensive data analysis of her experimental program. Professor Clawmark, she announced with obvious satisfaction. I have the final results from our comparative study. Final results. I dreaded whatever statistical evidence would further undermine our traditional approaches. Students in the interactive learning sections demonstrated 43% higher comprehension rates, 67% better problem-solving abilities, and 89% increased retention over time compared to traditional lecture-based classes. 89% increased retention. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Moreover, she continued with growing enthusiasm, students reported significantly higher satisfaction levels, increased motivation to pursue advanced studies, and improved confidence in their ability to understand complex concepts. Improved confidence in their ability to understand. Our traditional methods had been undermining student confidence. Dr. Starlight, I said carefully, are you suggesting that human teaching methods are superior to our established educational traditions? I'm suggesting that treating students with respect, encouraging their natural curiosity, and creating supportive learning environments produces better educational outcomes than forcing compliance through intimidation and boredom. Better educational outcomes. The evidence was overwhelming. But what about discipline? What about maintaining proper academic standards? What about respect for authority? Discipline comes from internal motivation rather than external force. Academic standards improve when students actually understand material instead of memorizing it. And respect for authority develops when authority demonstrates respect for students. Respect for authority develops when authority demonstrates respect for students. The relationship was reciprocal, rather than hierarchical. 6 months later, I found myself standing before the Galactic Educational Council, presenting our institution's dramatic transformation from traditional authoritarian teaching to collaborative human-inspired methodologies. Members of the council, I announced with newfound confidence, our adoption of interactive teaching methods has resulted in unprecedented improvements in student learning outcomes, faculty satisfaction, and institutional reputation. Faculty satisfaction. Even our instructors were happier when they stopped shouting at students and started engaging with them. Professor Clawmark, Council Chairman Steelclaw asked with obvious skepticism, "Are you seriously proposing that the galaxy's educational institutions abandon proven methodologies in favor of experimental human approaches?" "I'm proposing that we acknowledge that our proven methodologies were proving the wrong things," I replied. "We were measuring compliance instead of comprehension, obedience instead of understanding, submission instead of learning, measuring the wrong things. Our entire assessment system had been fundamentally flawed. Furthermore," I continued, "our human consultant has demonstrated that education should be a collaborative process between instructors and students, rather than an authoritarian imposition of information on passive recipients. Collaborative process, rather than authoritarian imposition." The transformation in my own thinking was remarkable. Dr. Starlight, who had been invited to address the council directly, stepped forward with characteristic confidence. "Council members," she said, "effective education isn't about controlling students. It's about inspiring them. It's not about forcing compliance. It's about encouraging curiosity. It's not about maintaining authority. It's about facilitating learning. Inspiring rather than controlling. The human approach to education in a single sentence." Dr. Starlight, Chairman Steelclaw asked, "What evidence do you have that these inspirational methods produce competent graduates?" "The evidence is sitting in this room," she replied, gesturing toward me. "Professor Clawmark has transformed from an authoritarian enforcer into an educational leader. His faculty has evolved from disciplinarians into facilitators. His students have changed from passive victims into active learners, from victims into learners, the most profound transformation of all. The real question," she continued, "isn't whether human methods work, it's whether you're willing to trust your students enough to treat them like intelligent beings who want to learn. Trust your students enough." The foundation of effective education. The council voted unanimously to implement human-inspired teaching methodologies across all educational institutions in the galaxy. Not because they were convinced by the evidence, but because their own children had started requesting transfers to schools that treated them with respect. As Dr. Starlight prepared to depart for her next assignment, apparently, half the galaxy wanted to learn about human educational approaches. How I reflected on how completely one sleeping human had revolutionized our understanding of teaching and learning. "Dr. Starlight," I said during our final meeting, "I have to ask, when you fell asleep during Professor Ironteeth's lecture, was that intentional?" She smiled with that characteristic human expression of innocent mischief. "Professor, sometimes the most effective way to demonstrate that something isn't working is to simply opt out of participating in it. Simply opt out of participating. Revolutionary through non-participation." And the student uprising that followed? Wasn't an uprising at all. It was just young beings finally seeing that they didn't have to suffer to learn. They didn't have to suffer to learn. The simplest and most revolutionary educational principle in the galaxy. As her transport disappeared into hyperspace, I turned back toward our transformed institution. where the sound of student laughter and enthusiastic discussion had replaced the oppressive silence of enforced compliance. But the real surprise came 6 months after Dr. Starlight's departure. I was reviewing our latest academic performance metrics when Grix burst into my office with unprecedented excitement. "Professor Clawmark," he announced breathlessly, "you need to see the galactic standardized assessment results." Galactic standardized assessments. The ultimate test of educational effectiveness across all known species. "What about them?" I asked, though his expression suggested either triumph or disaster. "Our students didn't just improve, they obliterated every previous record. Average scores increased by 78% across all subjects. Problem-solving assessments showed a 94% improvement. And most remarkably, our graduates are being recruited by advanced research institutions that had never considered our alumni before." 94% improvement. The numbers validated everything Dr. Starlight had taught us. Furthermore, Grix continued with growing amazement, 3 of our former Cubs have been accepted into the Galactic Institute for Advanced Sciences. Before Dr. Starlight's methods, we had never produced a single graduate qualified for their programs. Never produced a single qualified graduate. Our previous system had been limiting student potential rather than developing it. "But that's not the most interesting part," he added with obvious delight. "The Institute contacted us specifically to ask about our revolutionary educational methodologies. They want to implement our approaches in their own programs." Revolutionary educational methodologies. We had gone from educational laughingstock to academic trendsetter. "And Professor," he concluded with a grin that would have been unthinkable in our old authoritarian culture, "we've received a formal invitation to host the first Galactic Conference on Student-Centered Learning. Representatives from over 200 worlds want to study our transformation." Student-centered learning. Human concepts had become galactic educational standards. 3 weeks later, I found myself addressing the largest gathering of educators in recorded history. The conference hall contained representatives from species I had never even heard of, all eager to learn how to treat their students with respect and encouragement. "Colleagues," I announced to the assembly, "the most important lesson we learned from our human consultant wasn't about teaching techniques or classroom management. It was about fundamental respect for the intelligence and curiosity of every student. Fundamental respect. The foundation of effective education. When we stopped seeing students as problems to be controlled and started seeing them as minds to be inspired, everything changed. When we replaced fear with encouragement, compliance with engagement, and silence with discussion, our students transformed from passive victims into active learners. From passive victims into active learners. The ultimate educational achievement." As I watched educators from across the galaxy taking notes on human-inspired teaching methods, I realized that Dr. Starlight's greatest gift hadn't been her alternative techniques. It had been her unshakable belief that every student deserved to be treated like an intelligent being capable of amazing things. One sleeping human had taught us that the purpose of education isn't to break students into submission, but to awaken their natural desire to understand the universe. And once awakened, that desire proves to be the most powerful teaching tool in existence.